Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges as he explores turning the page on his life and yours. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, Paul. Have you ever wondered what it is that draws especially intelligent people to join a cult? Well, today we're about to find out. We will learn firsthand from our very special guest, Radhia Gleis, who was an elder for 25 years in a cult called the Buddha Field. As a young woman, Radhia went on a quest to discover nirvana and found herself entangled in a destructive cult. Now, for anyone tempted to judge cult followers as weak-minded or gullible, Radhia has a new book that will certainly shatter those assumptions. In her book, titled The Followers, she explores the common traits as well as the common needs that every human being possesses. And almost ironically, it is in these very common needs that cult leaders find their prey. Radhia has a message for all of us to understand as well as be wary of. Radhia Gleis is a nutritionist, biochemical analyst, and an educator. And with that, let's bring on our special guest, Radhia Gleis. Welcome to the next chapter with Charlie.
Hey, Charlie, thanks. Thanks so much for having me. It's a wonderful opportunity to talk to you.
I'm very much looking forward to this show. I've never done anything like this. You know, Paul and I were talking before the show. I don't know that I have ever met anybody in a cult. So this is a whole new curiosity venture for me. And
well, you might have. You just maybe not know it.
Oh, I'm sure I did. I'm sure
we're very clandestinely,
I know, and we will find out that more about that in the show. You know what I'd like to do to begin our discussion is I'd like to take a bit of time talking about your initial journey and how that led you to participation in what became the Buddha Field cult.
Well, okay. So let's roll the clocks back. I was born in the 50s. I was raised in the 50s and 60s and 70s in Los Angeles. I was raised actually in Brentwood, O.J. Simpson's neighborhood.
Oh, so you were raised with where they have those trees that money grows on.
Yes. And I talk about this. I was really, my mother and father were what I call the entrepreneur class. We weren't the super rich. We weren't the middle class. We were sort of in between. I hung out with the super rich. Went to school. Private school and private Catholic school with all of those guys, but we weren't. My father was an attorney. He was actually one of the 12 super lawyers in Los Angeles, and my mother was a fashion designer, and so I kind of grew up in a very privileged background, privileged lifestyle. But as I say in my book, and I start, my book is in 3 parts. So the first part is called The Journey, and that is my story up to, from the time I'm born up to when I met the cult leader, which it wasn't a cult. When I met them, it sort of morphed into that. But, so I grew up in a rather affluent background, and as a Catholic, and I've mentioned this in my book, to the Catholics, there's something called the age of reason. And to the Catholics, the age of reason is age 7. And that's when a Catholic can have Holy Communion, and they have to reach the age of reason. Mm-hmm. So when I reached the age of reason is pretty much when I left the Catholic religion, because it wasn't reasonable to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I continued to go to Catholic school, and to the school's credit, by the time I was a freshman, 9th grade, and I was about 14, we were studying comparative religions. And so we were studying, Christianity in general, and Hinduism and Buddhism and all the isms, right?
Right.
And so this teacher talked about, we were studying Hinduism, and he talked about this word nirvana. And I asked him what the word meant. And he said, well, some yogis in India, through a certain meditation, experience God directly. Next question. And I'm going, wait, whoa, what?
Hold on here. Back up.
You know? And I said, is that true? And he goes, well, apparently. And I'm like, well, if you know that, what are you doing here, dude? You know, you're calling yourself a theologian, but you're really not interested in the direct experience. Wow, okay. So from the time I was 14 up till I think I was about 26 years old, I was in search of nirvana. But I talk in
for
the
direct
book,
communion with God.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Or
Okay.
some would call it God realization or self-realization.
Okay. Okay.
And so I was in hot pursuit of that because I came to the conclusion at a very early age that you cannot say that God is all things, omnipotent, omniscient, all-loving, all of those alls, and that you are separate from God. That is an oxymoron. You can't say that.
Makes
God
no
is all
sense.
things.
I agree.
Right. So all things what, except for you? You know. So my thought was, well, if God is all things, then God must be in me somewhere, and there must be a way in. So if this meditation practice is the way in, then let me find it. So I went and spent, come on, Charlie, it was the 60s and 70s in Los Angeles. Drugs, sex, and rock and roll.
We're the same age. We're the same age, Radhia. So I mean, within a handful of years, and so I experienced all of that myself.
Yeah.
I was a hippie at UCLA.
Of course. So, and I went to Marymount across the street from UCLA. So we were in the height of what I say, you know, a cultural revolution. And so there was many things going on in our lives at that time. I mean, culture was being shaken to its core. So we were challenged with civil rights and gay rights and women's rights, and all of these things were happening simultaneously. So yes, I did a lot of psychedelics and all of that in pursuit. And while, you know, tripping, I got into lofty conversations with my compadres about the search for God realization, and really a lot of oh wow man kinds of moments. And then I, you know, went on. I went to Art Center College of Design. That was my first degree in Pasadena, and went on, became an adult, still searching, and I hadn't really found anything. I had read a lot at that point about different saints in far-off lands and far-off cultures that had experienced these kinds of God realization moments. But I had never met anyone in Western culture that said that they experienced that till I was about 25 or 26, and I met someone who had these 4 techniques. So that's sort of the short of it. So
you we'll cut the beginning, because you found I don't know, do you call it a guru or a leader that sort of led you along the path that led you to the individual that you ended up following? I would like to know, when you first, and you know, I will say his name is, you know, he's called many things, but his real name, we think, is Jaime Gomez, but he goes.
We know it's Jaime Gomez.
Oh, we do know. I wasn't sure we knew.
Yeah. No, that's his actual birth name.
But he's called Michelle, and
he was incognito a lot. So
yeah,
he had many names.
Yeah. Now, when you you had some experience before you met Jaime, I'm wondering, in your experiences and in your time with Jaime, what would you describe as your, I'm calling them internal holes, your needs, that you didn't feel were satiated by culture and society, and that something you were attempting to fill? What can you describe what those holes were, or what those needs might have been?
Yeah. Well, and that's in that first section of the book, The Journey, I talk about that even though I grew up in a very affluent life, all that glitters is not gold. And, I say in that third chapter, I came to the understanding that usually when you're running towards something, you're usually running from something.
Mm-hmm.
And I go into a little bit of the details of some of the trauma as a child that I went through. If you've ever seen the movie, or not the movie, if you ever saw the series Mad Men, remember that movie?
I saw parts of it. For some reason, I know it's so popular, but I didn't get into it, but I've seen episodes, so I'm familiar with it.
So that is like a real classic representation of that era.
Right.
And especially in the entrepreneur class that my parents were in. So I would describe my brother and I as latchkey kids with a governess. It's sort of like in those days, in the 50s and 60s, you had children, period. Whether you wanted them, whether you could have them or not, you simply had them. And so we were kind of like the furniture. We were just, my father went through World War II, so he was older, and so was my mother. And so they kind of didn't know how to raise kids. It wasn't like the parents today that are sort of the opposite, where they're, helicopter parents. My parents were MIA most of the time. So my father was a philanderer and running around with various women, and my mother was a career woman and a very powerful woman for that era. So she was an executive designer for, actually she opened the sportswear division for Catalina bathing suits.
Oh, really?
And so she traveled a lot. So she was in New York and Europe and Asia and whatever. And when she was gone, my father was in Vegas, so we kind of were alone. And my brother, unfortunately, was... he got into drugs, and he got into a lot of things, a lot of crime and drugs and violence. And so a lot of that was violence towards me. And that was all happening. My brother, I was tying my brother off while he's shooting crystal meth in his arm when I was 14. So there was a lot of trauma. And there's something in psychology called secure attachment, and I did not have secure attachment.
That's really understandable. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I was never a child ever. It's like you don't be a child in the Gleis family. You either become an adult and talk like an adult, and So I say in my book that instead of sort of sitting in my room alone with child development toys, I was learning the difference between a Ramus fizz and a gin fizz, and and how to make a perfect Rob Roy and things like that. So, and if you didn't do that, then you were either, MIA, or, in a lot of cases, my father was, unfortunately I had dyslexia, which in those days we didn't know what that word was. We didn't know anything about dyslexia in the 50s or 60s. So it was just a disciplinary problem. So my father was also abusive, mostly emotionally, but sometimes physically. So like I said, usually when you're running towards something, you're running from something.
So if I may, because I want to kind of move us a little bit here, am I correct in saying one of your personal big needs was a safe and loving attachment, a safe and loving relationship that you could depend on, that was not based so much on your performing or your acquiescing to somebody else's need. There was a sense for your identity and your attachment to something. Would you say those were big holes that you were attempting to fill in the process?
I would say very much a part of it, but let's take it a little step further.
Sure.
Because I was raised a Catholic, I learned all these stories of the saints.
Mm-hmm.
And so these saints had this sort of transcendental experiences where they were, at least the stories were, that they had union with God. That's what defined them as a saint. But they could go through all of this pain and suffering and sort of transcend that, transcend the mind, transcend the body, transcend their pain. So that was very appealing to me. Because I really didn't, yes, I agree with you, Charlie. I was looking for a community of like-minded people that I could find a safe home in. But I was also looking, because I really didn't trust anyone, for good reason, I was looking for that transcendental state, the state where only God would fill that hole. You know,
so that is that's really, you know, as I read you and study you, I'm finding just amazing similarities between participants need, what followers need, and what narcissistic and perhaps narcissistic sociopaths seem to fill are very similar to. There's a lot of similarities to the saints and to religion and
so.
You know, and I might add that, you know, in my study, these saints weren't trying to necessarily transcend, but in my understanding, Radhia, they were trying to transform. They were trying to take their needs that were just human needs and trying to transform them into intimacy with the divine and therefore oneness with the divine.
I would agree, and that's kind of that's the journey I set out on, because I was enamored with saints. Even though I left Catholicism, some of the stories of the saints kind of stuck with me, and I said, yeah, there has to be a way. These are tales of individuals in our past, in our history, that can say that they had some sort of transcendental experience that was beyond this world, and that's what I was looking for many reasons. But I just delineated some of them.
Okay, so you meet Jaime Gomez, and we'll talk about the documentary. And in the documentary, they refer to him mainly as Michelle. What's that?
Did you get to see it yet? Did you get to see it yet?
I almost saw it twice. It was so good.
Wow, wasn't it?
Oh, let's talk about that a second, just so people know what we're talking about. A documentary filmed and produced and edited and written by one of your cohorts, and you know, I don't know if you call them brothers or whatever, but Will Allen, and it's titled Holy Hell, which turns out to be a top 10 ranked documentary from both Sundance and Netflix. And the beauty, when I say the beauty, the genius of this documentary is it is archival footage. So it's not talking about the cult as much as it's actually portraying the behaviors, the pathologies, the needs. It's just you get to understand as deeply as someone like me could understand. You get to understand it on a whole different level. And so let's just do a quick plug for people to know it's
of us. So you will see me in that film. Yes, I'm.
Oh, you're a main character in that film.
Yeah. So I'm being interviewed, but you may not recognize me, but there's shots of me when I'm about 29, and I'm 68 now. So, you know, it really goes back 30 years of archival footage.
And that's the beauty of it is it's archival footage. It's not you're seeing all these things happening in an evolutionary way, and Will Allen
did a beautiful job, didn't he?
Well, and he describes himself as the videographer of the cult that Jaime wanted this videoed and captured. It turned out against him, obviously, but we're seeing actual footage. It's not actors, and it's not just talking about. It's showing. And so tell me now. Where I want to go now is that I want to talk about Jaime. You met Jaime a couple of times, and then you met him in a group, and the four of you started getting together and doing these. I can't pronounce it. Set songs. And
some people say satsang, some people say satsang, some people say satsang.
Okay, well,
whatever part of
it's one of those, but those are helping you in that union with some divine source. Can you talk to me about what those meetings were like in the beginning when you first? And this was around 1984, right?
Yes, exactly. I had met, and I go into the book, and I'm not going to spend time on that now, but I had moved to Florida, which is where Jaime came out of, or where the Buddha field sort of originally came from. And I had met a mutual friend of Jaime's, but Jaime was no guru when I met him, and he had come to Los Angeles. I was now moved back to Los Angeles, and there was a man by the name of Michael Basleon who was an initiate. Now, these techniques that I'm talking about originated from a guru by the name of Maharaji. Maharaji had a huge following in Florida, and so he had...
Was this a cult, or was this more legitimate?
Pardon me?
Was this a cult or more legitimate?
Yeah. I mean, it was more organized. Legitimate is an optimal word, but
okay.
Yeah, it was more organized for sure. It was, when you say, I mean, people say to me, it just cracks me up, why did you join a cult? Well, okay, first of all, nobody wakes up one day and says, I think I'm going to join a cult. I got nothing to do.
Yeah, it's not my number one goal in life.
And, you know this, being in L.A. at that period of time, there were cults on every block,
Oh,
so
yes.
you had your Scientologists and your Moonies and your Hare Krishnas and your Source Restaurant and all of that was there.
Right. Yeah, I had one with Kundalini Yoga that I did in...
of course.
That I did at UCLA.
Right, and you had Yogananda Center down on Sunset Boulevard and the beach. You had, the Vedanta Center. You had all of these different, things going on in L.A. at the time, and still are, I think. But I wasn't looking for that. I wasn't looking for that kind of organized group at all. I really was not. So, this quote-unquote cult sort of snuck up on me. And it snuck up on all of us. We started out, I met Jaime at he had come to visit Michael, and Michael was giving satsang for just a few of us, like maybe 2 or 3 or 4. And Jaime showed up because he was a friend of Michael's. And he wasn't showing up as, I'm this guru, I'm this teacher. He was just another guy, we were sharing tea and just talking and laughing, and he was just a really interesting guy. He was.
But am I not right to say that he was just another guy, but he was kind of unusually and extraordinarily charismatic? That there was something very attractive about him?
Well, yeah, he was. I mean, so if we back up just a little bit, Jaime came from Venezuela originally, and he tried to make it as an actor in Hollywood, and he was so dreadful at it. I mean, he really was, and he had.
They showed shots on the documentary that he just was horrible.
Oh God, yeah, those are real footage of him trying to do something in Hollywood. And they're pretty hysterical. But anyway, he was so bad, and he had this funky little accent that you could not figure out what it was. He never went by the name of Jaime Gomez. This is way after the fact. This is after this was revealed in 2016. No, actually, 2006 is when his name came out. But he originally in Los Angeles, his name was Michel Rostand. And that was his stage name. Well, it turns out he didn't make it in Hollywood, but he made it in porn films, which we didn't know until 2006. But yeah, he was.
And they were not heterosexual porn films, right?
No, he was gay, queerer than a $4 bill. I mean, he wasn't hiding it, right? So everyone knew it. Most of this was going on in West Hollywood, which is a very big gay community in Los Angeles. So, this was no mystery. He was going originally. He had his little group follow him from Florida, and there was about 8 of them that moved to Los Angeles when I first met them. And the first time I met him was at after, I had met him at Michael's and whatever. 2 years later, he got in touch with me, which I talk about in my book. And he invited me not to satsang. He invited me to an actor's workshop, an actor's class. And so I went, and we were doing some very, very interesting exercises. And it was a lot of fun and very, very introspective work, of looking at our ego. And so that's where I first got involved, and I really liked these people. There was only about 15 of us. And then they invited me to satsang that they were having in their house that they moved into in West Hollywood. And there was only literally about 15, and then, it was fun. We would go to satsang on Thursday nights, and we'd go to his acting class on Monday nights. And so we just started hanging out, and we started hanging out more and more. So, he would, like on a Sunday, he'd go to the beach or whatever, or Friday night we'd all go to the movies together.
So it was a very innocent connection to begin with.
Totally.
So you know what we because of the timing of the show here, because you and I can go. I know we've done this before. We can go 2 hours. I want to get into. Tell me about Jaime and his evolution from teacher, not wanting to be worshipped, not wanting to be looked on, and the evolution to where he turned into not just a guide, but a God man. What process happened in that?
So the original common denominator was the 4 techniques of the knowledge. That's the Primpal Rawat Maharaji referred to it as the knowledge. Eventually, Jaime changed the name to the knowing because he wanted to separate his identity from anyone finding out that it had anything to do with Maharaji. But anyway, so these initiates that came, the 15 of them, had all been initiated into this 4 techniques. And that was the thrust of everyone's interest. No one was interested in Jaime per se, but Jaime knew the techniques, and he was going to show them to you. So that was an initiation, a knowing session or a knowledge session. So in the beginning, when you walked into satsang, there was an altar room, and there's certain Indian traditions. Pranaming is one, which is prostrating. Mm-hmm. The Indians do this to revered teachers. They'll do it to grandparents. It's a sign of respect. Mm-hmm. So we would walk in, and there was usually an altar, and on the altar there were all kinds of pictures of Indian saints, Ramana Maharshi and Yogananda, and Ananda Moyama and Jesus and Buddha. And then there'd be a little picture of him,
Oh, so he got included in there. A little picture got included.
Well, he eventually did. Now, after a while, they were all in front. After a while, his picture became the largest, and they were all kind of put to the rear. But, we would come in and we would pranam at the altar. There'd be your token incense and candle. And
you would bow to the altar or prostrate yourself before the altar.
Prostrate completely, right?
Right.
And so then we would go in to him and prostrate again, just as a sign of respect to the teacher. And he would push us away and say, don't do that. Don't bow to me. What you're doing is, by pranaming, you are your head would represent your ego, yourself. And so when you put your head below your feet, you are offering your ego up to God. That was basically the first teaching that we got. So so we did that as a gesture to God, that we were willing to let go of our self-identity, our desires, our ambition, all of that stuff. Well, that was the original story. Well, after a while, generations who came in behind us would see us do that, and they would simply do that. Well, he stopped stopping them from that. After a while, that kind of felt good. So they didn't get the in-office memo about the, put your ego below your feet to God. And it started out in my initiation, which you would have these big, beautiful, incredible ceremonies of, dinner and food specially prepared and music and flowers and blah, 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 this whole preparation to be initiated. And when he first initiated me, he said, look, this has nothing to do with me. I'm the midwife, so to speak.
And this was like pre-1989, would that be right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was initiated in 1984. So he said, I am just here to show you these techniques. This is your divine birthright. And once you get them, I'm just here to help you practice them. But this is your now relationship with God.
So
right?
It felt like there felt like a sense of purity and not you couldn't feel the narcissism and the need for power and control at that point. So you very innocently you didn't join because he was the high and lofty. You joined because he was the guide, the intermediary. I think in the book you refer to it as the midwife.
Yeah, exactly. We weren't there to worship him at all. We were there to practice these techniques.
So when did the change occur? How did the change occur? Was it more and more people coming and him getting worship, and then all of a sudden he's believing his own bullshit, or was it was an intentional process of controlled evolution that he wanted to get there, but he was bright enough to know how to do that?
Yeah, I'm asked this question a lot, and I have written and have been asked to write articles on how to... the whole second portion of my book is talking about the pathology of a malignant narcissist. And there's a very distinct difference, and I really want to make that distinction, and I definitely do in my book, because I take the diagnostic manual of mental disorders line by line and show these characteristics not only in Jaime Gomez, but other spiritual and political leaders in our world that we're looking at right now. And so I go and show we all have a little bit of narcissism in it, but there's a very big difference between a malignant narcissist or a sociopath, where it's not a character flaw, it is a pathology. And so people ask me, do you think that Jaime was always like this, and was this all premeditated? My answer is I can never know what's in a person's mind. I really don't know when this premeditation started.
Very wise.
Some of his earlier followers that were with him said that he's known it all along and that this was his intention. I don't know, because he was playing it pretty well for us in the beginning, being very humble and being very, it's not about me, it's about your divine birthright with God and all of that. So what happened was he was reading, and turns out, and I didn't find this out, Charlie, until after I left, and actually after Holy Hell, I decided, because I was motivated by the film, to really dive deep into what is this guy's story and what is it that I missed in the last 25 years. And I come to find out that he's an absolute fraud from day one. From beginning to end, he was a fraud. And, the word con comes from the word confidence. So a good sociopath, a good malignant narcissist will be whatever you want them to be.
So we need to, I have so much to cover, and so I need to fast forward just a little bit here. And what I would like to know, what did you, in his process, in his evolution, you hung in for a handful of years. What were you receiving, Radhia? What was the benefit for your particular soul and your human needs?
Well, okay, so I was an initiate, and so the practice of the meditation, you really need to live in a world or a community where everyone knows what you're doing and everyone is doing it as well. Because, for example, our diet and our lifestyle was conducive to the meditation practice. So it's Dharma yoga, basically. And so being in an environment where there's selfless service, being in an environment where you are constantly checks and balances of the ego, you can't do that in the world. So the lifestyle...
It sounds like that sounds like an abbey or a monastery.
Very, very much so. We were a contemporary monastery without walls. But we all, in our little clandestine community, I loved these people. These were my brothers and sisters. This was my family. I had more in common with them and related to them more than I ever did my own family. So even after I started to notice this pathology grow in him.
When was that, Radhia?
I started to say he read a lot of these saints. So Ramana Maharshi and Yogananda and Osho, that was a biggie. And he would literally plagiarize all of what they said. So he would read in the morning, he would write a script, he would memorize the script, and then at the evening, in the evening satsang or whatever, it would just blossom out of his enlightened mind. Bullshit. It was all plagiarized. But anyway, he was reading about Muktananda. Muktananda was an Indian saint called the Shakti Guru.
Right.
And Shakti is, placing your finger on the forehead of your disciple, and you
on the third eye, they call it, right?
You are transmitting the Guru's divine energy to you. Okay, that's basically what Shakti is. Well, he started doing that. And when he was doing it publicly for a long time, and that's in the film, you'll see him doing that.
Oh, yes. Yes, out in the forest especially.
Yeah, and you'll see these people doing these gyrations, and very much like the Pentecostal, snake handlers and the wailing and crying and all of this sort of mass hysteria was happening. And it may have been coming from them. It wasn't coming from him, in my opinion. But, there was this mass hysteria. And he would do things, Charlie, like parlor tricks. Like when it wasn't working, he would take you in a private room and he would have some of his immediate entourage in on it. And he would use, he'd do a Shakti and have you close your eyes and then use a flashlight and wave it back and forth over your eyelids so you think it was light coming.
So you think you're getting light from the divine.
Yes, he was a total scammer,
So my question back in, I want to know what did Radhia receive as you're looking for nirvana? You're looking for this direct encounter with God. Did you experience that? Did you feel like you experienced that with Jaime?
Yes, not with Jaime. But I was an initiate, so when the initiates get the knowing, you're kind of on your own as far as your experience with God.
Oh, okay.
So when you're meditating, when you're in that meditation, which went on for at least an hour or two a day, you're in the privacy of your own room. You're not around him. And the experiences I describe in the first chapter of the second section, called The Knowing and the Shakti Scam. And I describe, and I think Will Allen depicts it in the film pretty well.
Yes, he does. He really does.
You have the light of God, the celestial music, the nectar, and the word. And those were the 4 techniques that you experience. And some people experience them more than others. And so the people that didn't experience anything, Jaime would create these little parlor tricks to make them think that they were. So, and like I said in my book, those who, when everybody in satsang, that's all they're talking about is these experiences. And they're one after the other stories of these, wow, the light was just, and there were colors and there were geometric shapes and all of this other stuff. Now,
like a psychedelic experience almost.
Very much a psychedelic experience. So that was very much true for some of us. For some, they didn't experience anything, but they would never dare say that in satsang. So they would listen to everybody else. And, like I said in my book, no one wants to be the dud, right? So they would never admit that they didn't experience anything. So it was a collective deception.
Let's take that thought, and I'd like to move to take that thought and sort of transition to where I think community, as I've read and we've spoken, that community is absolutely essential in this cult.
Very much.
And
Very much.
And there is a groupthink, there is a camaraderie that's unlike any other camaraderie, yet there are expectations, and if you do not adhere to the expectations, you face embarrassing and horrible
dire consequences. Absolutely.
Dire consequences. Tell me about the community. Tell me about how important this was for you.
Well, okay, so first of all, usually in any kind of group, there's this sort of indoctrination of elitism. So when you think that you're in the elite, especially the initiates, then the rest of the world, the outside world, pales in comparison, first of all. So
because you have, like you said, you have relationships that you've not had before, like-minded people seeking the same thing. I know there was one little quote in the documentary that early on they said, "We look like a cult, but if we're a cult, we're a good one."
Yeah, that's what. I mean, the word cult, and I use in the first chapter of the third section of my book is entitled, "What is a Cult? It's Complicated."
Right, right.
That word, that 4-letter word, cult, is a really misunderstood word. And it is such a scary word because of people like Jim Jones and Charlie Manson that you will never admit that you're in one. Because it's too scary, because it's got such a stigma to it that you're afraid to even contemplate, is this a cult? But we did. After a while, like after, I don't know, a decade or so, we started looking around going, is this a cult? I mean, we'd kind of joke about it or whatever, and like Philippe in the movie said, well, if it's a cult, at least it's a good cult.
And you were at this point, you're nearing 100 to 150 members, something like that. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. So we were still small, and that's kind of the unique thing that I had is I was in the embryonic stages of a cult when it wasn't, and because I was in it for so long, I saw its evolution. And I saw the evolution of a narcissist turn into a malignant sociopath. And that took time. It was sort of like the old saying of the frog in warm water.
Right, the frog in the kettle, yeah.
By the time you are in it, getting out of it is not that easy.
Yeah, you're boiled.
You're boiled, and you're...
Because it's raising, the temperature is raising 1 degree a minute.
Right. So you've got this identity now, and the identity is special. It's elite. And you've got these elite friends. So nothing on the outside looks interesting, number one. Number two, you've seen people leave before you and how they're demonized and ostracized. And we all did it. We all did it. We all judged, and we all had those sort of demonizing, elitist kinds of attitudes if you left. And he would use public displays of condemnation of those people, of how they just missed in this life. And they're just destined for bad karma because they have forsaken God and forsaken their birthright and all this dialogue.
Fear of disenfranchisement. I mean, it's just...
Total fear. And so the fear of, I wanted to leave in 1995, but I didn't leave till 2006. So it's difficult. It's not, it takes a tremendous amount of courage because you will, and I did, everything I was afraid of happened. I lost everything. I lost 150 of my best friends and family in one day. I lost a 20-year relationship. I went bankrupt. I lost my house. I lost my clinic. I lost everything.
Did you feel it was worth it? Did you feel the trade-off was worth the internal the internal enlightenment and the community? Was that trade-off okay?
That's a real hard question to answer. What was worth it is finally separating from him. What was not worth it is losing my friends, my family, and the culture. And I still, and people who I'm still close to in the Buddha field will say this, that we miss the Buddha field. We miss that life.
That was obvious in the documentary. Yeah, the sadness. I mean, the tears, and it was tears. It was. I felt it was not tears of shame, but tears of pain. No. Sheer tears of I've lost the closest people I've ever had to me in my life.
Exactly, and beautiful people. I mean,
yes, they were. It was obvious.
Different cults, but ours was all about love. It was all about selfless service and serving something higher than yourself. Now, some of the earlier, the younger disciples, the thing that they were serving that they thought was higher than them was Jaime. But to the elders, that's not what we were about. We used Jaime as a practice of selfless service. This is why when people, and I want to talk about this word brainwash because
I want to do that. I want to do that in phase 2. But I will I will mark it. But I know it's a very important word to you, and I think it's a critical word for our audience to understand.
Yeah.
I have 2 questions before we lead to break. One is a shorter question, and one is perhaps you've already addressed. As I have been reading your book, looking up online, studying, pondering, dare I say, praying about this. It appears to me that, we talked about human need and the human condition, what we need. I seem to see 2 very important human needs, and I wonder what you think of them. And I'm looking at them as community and connection. And the community represents your people, and the connection represents your connection with the divine through a midwife leader. Would you say those are 2 essential elements to a cult?
Very much. And I think, to ours, like there are different cults and there are different flavors of cults, but in the only one that I have reference to, and I have pretty darn good reference to.
25 years, you think?
Yeah, 25 years. I'm no lightweight. The thing that I think was essential, it's very complex, Charlie, very, very complex. You have to understand that not only was it camaraderie with your like-minded peers, and we were all on a mission to serve something higher than mediocrity. We were looking around in the world, and this is, of course, why we went to the movies every week, and this is why we were doing exercises every week. We were exploring the mediocrity of the world and how people, they put all of their time into nonsense, into foolery, and they live a sort of vapid life.
What's interesting is that it seems you had a preconceived filter through which you were viewing films rather than viewing them, what do they have to tell me? I'm viewing sort of an agenda filter and see how does this fill my preconceived notions? Is that accurate or is that not accurate?
Well, I think that's the way we are in everything, isn't it? I mean, we all have these filters. We can't help.
Oh yeah, we have filters, but some of us are innately and enormously curious that I'm ready to accept new thought and challenge my thought. That's just part of my personality. Certainly, am I programmed to a degree? Yes, of course. I mean, that's, where, as you pointed out to me, and I think it's so rightly so, we are indoctrinated at birth. Right. we are taught things to believe and not to believe, and especially children, it's very dualistic because children can't understand the non-dualistic mind.
The moment we come out of the womb, we're identified. You're a male, you're a female, you're white, you're black, you're Asian, you're American, you're Texan, you're Californian, you're this and that. All these labels are slapped on us. Innocent. We're innocent. We're just raw little beings. We come out of the womb, hello, and all of a sudden they literally put a bracelet on you.
But even the parents are innocent because they're so they're so engaged and so embrace these philosophies that they feel it's very important to educate and bring up their children with that. I have one last question before a break, and I think you've already answered it, but maybe you could give me some criteria. You had said like 10 years before you began to doubt. I was wondering, can you recall an experience in your 25-year journey? What time in your experience did you first begin to question the message of Jamie?
Sure. I explain in my book, and this is why one reason why I was compelled to write this book, is because when you look at Holy Hell, the film, you're looking at 100 minutes. It is near impossible to tell a 30-year story of 150 people who all have 150 of their own stories in 100 minutes. So my relationship with Jaime was very, very different. Everybody's had their own unique relationship with him. Mine was unique because I had known Jaime as a friend before I got involved, so therefore I was never in the hunt for a master or a guru or whatever. A lot of the people who came in, that's what they were looking for. Mm-hmm. I was never looking for that, and I was a little older, a little bit more educated than many who came in. So I became, as an elder, I was sort of like, I hate to say it, I was like Jaime's Michael Cohen. Because my father was a lawyer and I was steeped in the law growing up, I handled all of Jaime's legal advice. I handled and hired lawyers for him and private detectives and what have you. I was also his medical advisor. So imagine, Charlie, when you're the advisor to the most important man or human being in your world, what that does to your ego, first of all.
Oh, my goodness, yes, of course.
And that's why I really understand Michael Cohen. I do understand why he did what he did, and I get it. But the relationship I had was very different than a lot of people. So where I started to see him really unravel was we were in Los Angeles, and there was a guy who he was an older guy, very unattractive, weird kind of guy, who came to satsang, who had a Woody for one of the young girls who was working for me. And she obviously wasn't really interested in him in a
Woody.
Yeah, a Woody.
We're betraying our age here. We'll just let people look it up.
Yeah, right. Well, they'll figure it out. Anyway, she wasn't interested in him romantically, but he could not accept that. So he began to blame Jaime for brainwashing her into not having interest in him. So he started stalking her. And he started leaving threatening letters on her car, basically saying what he was going to do. He was going to get involved with Cult Awareness Network, and he was going to take the cult down, and he was going to kill Jaime, and he was going to kidnap her, and he was going to have her deprogrammed, which was popular in those days. For a mere $25,000, you could have your family member sequestered in the desert and abused until they gave up the cult. That was what was going on. So I, being the legal advisor, I had this guy investigated, and he was a real nut job, and he had been institutionalized for 17 years, and he basically was dangerous. And he had been arrested for battery, assault and battery, and spousal abuse, and booked. So I hired lawyers to put him in jail, and I did. We put him in jail for about 3 months. That's all the DA could hold him. So the DA said, look, I can't hold him for longer than 3 months, so you better get out of Dodge. So this is when we fled, literally, Los Angeles. And this is when I started to see Jaime's paranoia, rightfully so. I mean, the guy wanted to kill him, but I saw his paranoia blossom. And so on the road, looking for a new place to go, I and the immediate entourage, this was a handful, including Will Allen and including, I would say, maybe a little over half a dozen of us who traveled with him. And they traveled, I had money at the time, so I sponsored a lot of his travels and things like that. And I watched him start to disintegrate, and I started seeing him become obsessive and paranoid. So it was at that point, and I'd say that was like 1991.
Oh, so it was pretty soon.
Yeah, it was pretty soon. Well, I had been there for what?
7 years or so.
7 years, yeah. So now I start seeing a different side of him. And I started seeing, I started seeing him unravel. And I'm like, where's God in all of this? It's like he was now paranoid that Cult Awareness Network was pursuing him. And we had then moved to Texas, and he saw Waco happen right there. And He started thinking, I'm next, right? And I'm like, what do you mean you're next, dude? You are really impressed with yourself that you think that the ATF is going to be at our door any minute. But he really did. And so it was at that point that I started seeing another side of him, that I was losing my enchantment with him, shall we say.
What then kept you hanging in after that, after you saw it? What was the attraction for you to remain for another 17, 18 years?
Well, understand, first of all, like I said, there was the initiate. So I didn't need him per se for any kind of spiritual development or whatever. So he became sort of like an eccentric uncle to me. I did not know that there was abuse going on. So he was just kind of like this crazy uncle. And the thing was that he was the glue that held the community together. So I didn't want to lose my community. My family was dead at that point. My brother had disowned me. I had no one on the outside, and he wasn't a threat to me. I didn't know that he was a threat to me or anyone else at the time, so I just sort of let him be his goofy self, and he would just do his silly things. But my friends that I talk to now, they go, "Oh my God, Radhia, you could not hide your feelings. You were so angry for about a decade."
Oh,
for
really?
About 11 years.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, and I didn't even know that it was showing. Apparently I can't hide my feelings on my face. So I would go to like satsang or class or some event, and I would like sit in the back of the room and disappear. I would meditate, so I'd go into meditation, or I'd fall asleep, just to avoid seeing his narcissistic shenanigans, which started to disgust me after a while. All of this display of people, getting Shakti and writhing around on the floor and laughing and crying and doing all of this stuff. It made me sick. So I understand I was still living a life. I didn't live, none of us lived together. I mean, we may have had maybe 2 or 3 or 4 people living in a house scattered around Austin. I owned his house. And I owned my house, and my house was my clinic. So I had a business.
You had a life.
Practice.
Yeah,
I had a life.
I'll tell you what. With that, because I'm noticing our time, and we're going to go.
Okay.
We've got some time to go. So because I have a whole different set of questions, I'm going to kind of take a little bit of a change of direction. So let's take a break. We'll take a change of directions, and we'll explore some very interesting topics and then wrap it up. Be sure to check out Radhia's book, The Followers, Holy Hell. I will have a link on the show notes. Now, this concludes part 1 of our show on the nature of cults. This episode was so informative and so fun that we had to break it into 2 shows. Please be prepared to catch part 2 in just a couple of days, where Radhia shares what she learned and what we can learn from her experiences. As usual, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.